on my thesis, Saving the Planet, or So You Think. Why mandating electric vehicles is not the answer. So, besides those biodegradable paper straws that just fall apart in your mouth, when people think about saving the planet, they may think about recycling, removing trash from the ocean, or driving an electric car. Electric cars are claimed to be clean solutions for the environment, but is this actually true? This leads to more questions. What is considered clean? And will electric vehicles actually save the planet? Caring for the earth has always been an important matter, as seen in Genesis 2:15, which states, "The Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." However, with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere currently sitting at 422 parts per million, when ideally it should be between 250 and 380, something must be done. If no action is taken, then the Disney Pixar film WALL-E will become a reality. Humans will be forced to build spaceships and live in space, while tiny robots attempt to cleanse the earth and make it habitable once again. Some factor must be causing this rise in carbon, but are electric vehicles the solution to lower carbon emissions? Electric vehicles, also known as EVs, are powered by electricity rather than gasoline. Almost everyone has an opinion on EVs. Some will say that they are better for the environment because they produce less carbon than the typical gas-powered car, also known as an internal combustion engine vehicle, or ICE vehicle for short. Others will say that they cannot give up their muscle car for some quiet EV that doesn't go vroom vroom. Regardless of one's viewpoint, the ICE versus EV controversy has been around for nearly 100 years, first beginning in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, ICE vehicles came out on top as the more popular option, and EVs went under the radar for quite some time. However, times are beginning to change, for EVs have risen once again. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, designed his EVs to look more appealing and to operate with better range and performance than they had in previous years. This resulted in people beginning to purchase EVs once again. By the end of 2023, there were an estimated 3.3 million EVs in America, and 1/3 of those EVs were sold that same year. Evaluating electric vehicles as a whole is beyond the scope of this argument. Rather, this thesis will cover privately owned vehicles, specifically on legally banning ICE vehicles, and completely disregard other such forms of transportation. Banned for the sake of this argument will be defined as to prohibit the use, distribution, and performance, and in this circumstance specifically, ICE vehicles. Careful consideration should be taken when debating whether or not ICE vehicles should be legally banned. Many states, including California, New York, and Oregon, have already implemented plans to ban the sale of ICE vehicles in the near future. Fossil fuels will eventually run out, but there is still currently 1.35 trillion barrels of oil left in the world, which will take about 38 years to consume. However, there is still plenty of oil that has not been drilled, so humans will be able to benefit from fossil fuels for decades to come. However, just because fossil fuels are non-renewable does that necessarily mean that electricity is the best form of alternative fuel. ICE vehicles should not be legally banned. First of all, EVs are not as clean as they are believed to be, and there are many hidden pollutants that factor into this. Second, they are impractical for many Americans, and not everyone can seamlessly make the change from gas to electric. And finally, the electrical grid is not sufficient enough to support this change. EVs produce more carbon than a typical gas-powered car. However, other pollutants such as nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, and other greenhouse gases are produced at a much higher rate throughout the lifetime of the car. Nitrogen oxides, when combined with ozone, plays a part in thinning the ozone layer. When this happens, UVB levels increase and lead to skin cancer and can harm marine life. Sulfur dioxides, when combined with water and air, form sulfuric acid, which is the main component found in acid rain. And acid rain causes deforestation, harms marine life, and corrodes building paints and materials. PM10 particles are small airborne particles that are also produced by EVs. These particles have a diameter of 10 micrometers or less and can be very detrimental to humans if inhaled. These emissions will continue to pollute the air until better technology is implemented in order to limit or to either eliminate or limit the amount of pollution in the air. The batteries that power EVs are also very different than the batteries in a typical ICE vehicle. EV batteries are much larger and are used to power the entire car rather than used to start the engine. They also use more voltage than a typical house. Additionally, 500,000 pounds of raw materials need to be mined, moved, and extracted in order to make one singular EV battery. And while most of these materials can be put back after extraction, it still takes a ton of time, money, and fuel just to acquire a small portion of materials. And experts predict that 6 to 10 times the amount of materials needed for EV batteries will be needed in the future as the EV market expands. All the work and fuel that goes into the EV production process is what causes it to be dirtier than the ICE vehicle production process. Is the claim that EVs are a clean solution for the environment true? Well, in order to answer this, we need to look at carbon parity. Carbon parity is the point in time where an ICE vehicle and an EV have produced the same amount of carbon in their lifetime, which is the point where these two lines intersect on this graph. In order to reach carbon parity, an EV needs to be driven 13,500 miles in order to make up for the pollution during the production process. A big reason for this is the amount of fossil fuels used during electrical generation. Fossil fuels account for 60% of electricity generation, renewables account for 30%, and nuclear generates the other 10%. But why is carbon such a prevalent topic when it comes to cars? Well, carbon is linked to increasing the Earth's temperature, and since many people are concerned about the Earth's temperature rising and climate change, it is bound to be prevalent in discussion. In addition, EVs are not truly zero-emission vehicles. A big reason for this is the amount of carbon that they still end up producing while charging. According to a study done at MIT, EVs still produce 200 grams of CO2 per mile driven. And while ICE vehicles produce 350 grams, which is 75% more, EVs are still not zero-emission vehicles. It is similar to thinking you are being a responsible person by taking out the trash every week, when in reality, the trash is just sent somewhere else, making that area now polluted. Carbon emissions are primarily considered a problem since they are linked to increasing the temperature of the Earth. Since 1850, which is when the Earth's temperature began to be recorded, the Earth's temperature has increased 0.11 degrees Fahrenheit every decade, or about 2 degrees overall in the past 175 years. That is only 0.01 degrees every year, and that rate has not changed, even with 3.3 million EVs entering the picture. Even though more and more EVs are being purchased, not everyone can seamlessly make the change from gas to electric. A big reason for this is the inconvenience that arises with EV charging. Not everyone can or is willing to spend the hours it takes to charge an EV. The old maxim that time is more valuable than money greatly applies to EV charging. There are 3 types of EV chargers. Level 1 chargers, which come when purchasing an EV, Level 2 chargers, which are installed at public stations, and DC fast chargers, which are less commonly installed at public stations, but are primarily used for road trips. With a Level 1 charger, it would take 24 hours to fully charge your EV. And with a Level 2 charger, it would take about 6 hours. And even with a DC fast charger, which have the shortest charging times, it still takes a full hour to charge your EV. With a DC fast charger, you could drive to Dallas on a single charge using the best EVs on the market, but you would have to wait an hour before you could return. Or let's say you wanted to take a family road trip to Colorado. You would have to take 2 to 3 one-hour stops on your way there, and then 2 to 3 more on the way back. This is significantly longer than the few minutes it takes to fill up an ICE vehicle with gas at the gas station. So, saving money at the pump may not be worth the extra time spent charging EVs. On top of longer charging times, EVs have significantly less range than ICE vehicles. The average EV can only get around 155 miles per charge. And while it's a bit more complicated to calculate the average range of an ICE vehicle, the average ICE vehicle can hold around 15 gallons of gas and get about 25 to 27 miles a gallon, which is around 400 miles. There are only 3 EVs that have a better range than the average ICE vehicle, and this is extremely significant. Another factor families take into consideration is the extra costs that come along with owning an EV. The average EV, the upfront cost with an EV is around $56,000. And the average ICE vehicle is around $48,000. Insurance is also more expensive with owning an EV, averaging $1,100 more per year to own. It is already hard enough for many families to afford a car, so being forced to switch from gas to electric, with electric being even more expensive, will make it even harder. Even if you were willing to deal with the decreased range, increased charging time, and extra costs, there is another factor that may make a mandatory switch impossible, and that is the electrical grid. The grid cannot currently support the mainstream change from gas to electric, since it is not growing at a fast enough rate to support EVs. However, this raises the question, will the grid ever be ready? The short answer is yes, but it's a bit more complicated than just a simple yes. First of all, a ton of money and resources will be needed to offer everyone access to EV charging. And all the millions of dollars and the ton of resources that will be spent on people living in low populated areas may not be worth all the time, money, and resources. Additionally, electricity production has increased 3% annually in the past 75 years, while EVs only require 1% growth if they are continuing to be produced at their current rate. So it seems that the electrical grid should be able to support EVs in the future. However, if an EV mandate were to be enacted, then that is when the grid will not be able to keep up and problems will arise. Many EV charging stations exist, but just because they exist does not necessarily mean that they work properly. Many of the charging stations are already occupied, and of the ones that are unoccupied are often out of order. This is a big problem that arises with EVs, that there are not enough stations. In 2023, Wall Street Journal's Joanna Stern tested 30 charging locations in LA. She tested a total of 126 chargers and found that problems occurred at over 40% of the locations. These problems included that the machines were out of order, there were payment issues, or connection issues between the car and charger. The infrastructure is not ready for an all-EV future, so mandating EVs would not be a wise approach. In fact, it would take $2 to $4 trillion just to build up the required infrastructure to support an all-EV future. That is enough money to end world hunger for the next 50 to 100 years. There are much better ways to go about reducing carbon in the atmosphere at a much lower cost, such as implementing taxes. Some of these taxes could be a carbon tax and/or a gas tax. A carbon tax could work in a way where industries would have to pay a certain amount of money based on the amount of carbon they produce as an industry. And a gas tax would work similar to a state tax. Regardless, both of these would affect the consumer, therefore increasing the price of gas, causing more people to switch from gas to electric. However, if these taxes were implemented properly, it could incentivize lower carbon emissions and reduce carbon in the atmosphere rather than banning ICE vehicles altogether. The most prevalent argument for mandating EVs is that they produce less greenhouse gases than ICE vehicles. And while they have been found to produce less greenhouse gases on the road, classifying them as zero tailpipe emission vehicles, the EV production process is actually dirtier. As I stated before, fossil fuels are responsible for the majority of electricity production, and as a result, carbon emissions increase. If people are truly concerned about carbon emissions, then an EV mandate is not the best pathway to do so. Other ways to do this would be by planting more trees and preserving forests. Trees naturally reduce carbon in the atmosphere, but humans keep chopping them down. God has already provided ways to naturally maintain CO2 levels in the atmosphere, but we are just too stubborn to admit it. Another common argument to support EVs is that they are easier and cheaper to maintain. While it is cheaper to recharge an EV, maintaining an EV is actually more expensive, despite the simpler design. In January of 2024, Hertz announced that it will be dumping 20,000 of its EVs due to higher repair costs than expected. This was over 1/3 of their entire EV fleet, and most of the unexpected expenses came from these higher repair costs. The Hertz vice president noted that the damage and repair costs on an EV can be about twice as expensive as with a comparable combustion engine vehicle. Even if the EV battery is damaged in the slightest in an accident, it should still be replaced in most circumstances because it can become very dangerous and prone to ignite. And the average EV battery replacement can range anywhere between $5,000 and $15,000. When Hertz initially began renting out EVs, customers were offered free 24-hour test drives. Customers could try out the EV for the day, and if for whatever reason did not prefer it, could return it and rent a nice vehicle instead. And this is exactly what customers did. They continued to rent the ICE vehicles. So, using some of the proceeds from selling many of their EVs, Hertz decided to reinvest in ICE vehicles to meet consumer demand. Clearly, EVs not only burn a hole in one's pocket, but the lack of demand shows that people prefer to drive ICE vehicles rather than EVs. A point that is brought up to refute claims made against the EV infrastructure is that as EVs increase in popularity, problems that currently exist will be solved during innovation. And while it is still beneficial to seek to solve problems, innovation needs to happen first. A great example of this is the COVID shot. In December of 2020, the COVID vaccine was made available to everyone over the age of 16, and it was also developed in record time. Prior to this, the shortest development time for a vaccine was the mumps vaccine in the 60s, which took about 4 years. However, the COVID vaccine was developed in less than 12 months. And since it was so new, many side effects came along with it, such as severe blood clots, low platelet counts, and inflammation of the heart. Perhaps if more time was spent in development, these side effects could have been prevented. In comparing this to a potential EV mandate, if EVs were to be mandated before the infrastructure could support them, there likely would be many side effects, including blackouts, inflation, and others which we may be unaware of. These counter-arguments support my thesis that ICE vehicles should not be legally banned. I also made 3 arguments to support this thesis. First, EVs are not truly clean vehicles, but rather produce harmful emissions. Second, due to factors such as range, cost, and charging time, EVs are not an ideal fit for everybody. And finally, due to considerations such as the limited electrical grid and the lack of infrastructure, it is not reasonable to ban ICE vehicles or to mandate EVs. Consequently, ICE vehicles should not be legally banned. Ultimately, the issue of mandating goes against the human freedom to discern for themselves. People should be able to analyze the data, just as I have done. They should weigh the pros and cons of the issue and come to the decision themselves. People should decide if they want to hop on the EV bandwagon or to continue to drive an ICE vehicle in peace. Thank you.